Nikitha Gautashala lived by structure. At 27 years old, she worked as a data and strategy analyst and resided in Ellicott City, Maryland. Her daily life followed patterns shaped by planning, documentation, and accountability. Colleagues and family described her as organized and methodical, someone who valued clarity and closure in both professional and personal matters. She approached decisions carefully and expected the same level of responsibility from others. When she loaned money to a former housemate, that same mindset guided her actions. The transfer was deliberate. The expectation of repayment was direct and understood from the beginning. Family members later confirmed that Nikitha had lent approximately $4,500 to the former housemate. The money was not given casually or without discussion. It was intended as temporary help with the clear understanding that it would be paid back. Over time, portions of the loan were returned. The repayment process, however, slowed and eventually stalled. By the end, a remaining balance of about $1,000 was still unpaid. For Nikitha, this was not a loose or informal arrangement. It was a defined obligation that had not been completed. The remaining amount represented responsibility and follow-through, not kindness or charity. As months passed, the lack of resolution began to weigh on her. By the end of 2025, delays had continued long enough to change patience into resolve. Messages asking about repayment no longer produced clear responses. Explanations became repetitive and less convincing. What had once been framed as a temporary difficulty now felt like avoidance. From Nikitha's point of view, asking for the remaining money was neither aggressive nor unreasonable. It was a practical step to close a financial matter that had remained unfinished for too long. For the person who owed the money, the situation carried a different emotional meaning. According to family statements and police findings, the former housemate was Arjun Sharma, a man who had once shared living space with Nikitha. Their prior familiarity removed any emotional distance that might exist in a transaction between strangers. The debt was not abstract or impersonal. It was tied to someone he knew well and someone who expected accountability. Each reminder reinforced that expectation. As repayment stalled, avoidance became a way to cope with mounting pressure. Each unanswered message postponed the moment of reckoning. Each delay allowed time to pass without resolution. What may have started as discomfort or embarrassment slowly grew into anxiety. The longer the balance remained unpaid, the harder it became to address directly. The situation tightened as options narrowed. This pressure increased because Sharma was preparing to leave the United States for India. Family members later stated that Nikitha was aware of his upcoming departure. From her perspective, the travel plans created urgency. Once he left the country, recovering the remaining money would become far more difficult. From his perspective, the approaching departure date removed room for further delay. The unresolved loan, once manageable, became an immediate and unavoidable issue. Nikitha was last seen on December 31, 2025, when she traveled to an apartment on Twin Rivers Road in Columbia, Maryland. The purpose of the visit was specific and financial. Her family emphasized publicly that there was no romantic relationship involved and no social reason for the meeting. She went there to discuss repayment of the remaining loan balance and to resolve the matter face-to-face. Inside the apartment, the discussion entered what investigators later described as a point of escalation. There was no third person present, no neutral mediator, no written agreement to rely on. The setting was private, familiar, and confined. In that environment, the financial dispute became personal. Tension rose as the conversation focused on responsibility, timing, and accountability. Police later confirmed that Nikitha was killed inside the apartment. She suffered multiple stab wounds, according to law enforcement statements. At that moment, the dispute stopped being about money in any practical sense. The loan itself no longer mattered. What remained was an emotional breakdown under pressure, where fear and panic overtook restraint and control. The situation crossed a line from conflict into irreversible violence. The aftermath unfolded quickly. On January 2nd, 2026, Nikita was reported missing. The missing person report was filed before her body was discovered, a detail that later became part of the investigation timeline. The following day, January 3rd, 2026, police located her body inside the Columbia apartment. The discovery confirmed that she had not simply disappeared, but had been killed where the meeting took place. As evidence accumulated, investigators identified Sharma as the primary suspect. Howard County Police obtained an arrest warrant charging him with first and second-degree murder. By the time the warrant was issued, authorities confirmed that Sharma had already left the United States and traveled to India. Flight became the final act of avoidance. The same pattern seen throughout the dispute, delay, deflection, and withdrawal, reappeared under far more serious circumstances. What began as an unresolved loan expanded into a homicide investigation that crossed international boundaries. What followed did not end with this case. The same pressures remained, carrying forward into another situation where obligation, delay, and fear again collided. As one story closes, the next begins in familiar territory, shaped by unresolved expectations and private conflict, unfolding in a different place but driven by the same forces. If you believe this video should be seen by more people, please support my channel by smashing the like button and subscribing. I'd really appreciate the support. Thank you very much. Now moving on to the second case. On May 2nd, 2025, Naisha Mendez was found dead along a dirt path near the crematorium at Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut. Police responded after receiving a report of a body on the cemetery grounds, an area that is normally quiet and lightly traveled. From the moment officers arrived, the circumstances made it clear that this was not a natural death. The location, the position of the body, and visible injuries prompted investigators to secure the area immediately and treat the scene as a homicide. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner later confirmed that Mendez had suffered multiple stab wounds. That determination removed any remaining uncertainty about the cause of death and set the direction of the investigation. Rather than centering the case on emotion or speculation, detectives focused on practical questions. Where had Mendez been before she arrived at the cemetery? Who had she been communicating with? And how had she ended up in a location so far removed from routine daily activity? Naisha Mendez's life ended after a dispute centered on money moved from private tension to irreversible violence. There was no public argument, no extended confrontation witnessed by others, and no drawn-out series of events. The situation followed a quieter and more common pattern. Two people knew each other. A financial expectation existed. Pressure grew as that expectation remained unmet. The absence of distance between them allowed the disagreement to become personal rather than procedural. What gives the case its weight is not the volume of details, but the steady movement toward a fixed outcome. Investigators described no explosion of conflict. Instead, the record reflects a gradual tightening of circumstances, where insistence replaced flexibility and communication narrowed over time. The focus remained on how a relatively small amount of money came to dominate the interaction between two people. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, attention turned to Edwin Arroyo Roman, a 55-year-old man who had known Mendez and had been in contact with her shortly before her death. According to arrest records and police statements, Arroyo Roman believed that Mendez owed him approximately $700. The amount itself was not unusual. Investigators emphasized that the significance of the dispute was not the sum, but the persistence attached to it. Financial disputes often follow a predictable path. One person believes repayment should already have happened. The other may delay, question the urgency, or struggle to meet the expectation. Messages accumulate. Each exchange carries more tension than the last. Over time, the room for compromise becomes smaller. In this case, authorities did not describe a history of threats or previous violence. Instead, they documented repeated insistence and continued contact, suggesting a disagreement that had hardened rather than resolved. Surveillance footage and investigative findings placed Arroyo Roman with Mendez near the time she was last seen alive. Investigators tracked movements through confirmed locations and timestamps, building a sequence that aligned with the discovery of her body at Evergreen Cemetery. The case did not rely on dramatic presentation. Prosecutors emphasized sequence, proximity, and corroboration. Phone records, video evidence, and forensic findings were used to establish who was present, when contact occurred, and where events unfolded. On May 6, 2025, New Haven police arrested Arroyo Roman and charged him with murder and tampering with evidence. He was held on a $3 million bond as the case entered the court system. Police stated that during questioning, Arroyo Roman admitted to killing Mendez. With that admission, the investigation shifted from identification to documentation. The private disagreement over money became a formal criminal case, governed by statutes, evidence rules, and judicial process rather than personal justification. Following the arrest, members of Arroyo Roman's family told authorities and media outlets that he had previously been diagnosed with dementia. Police acknowledged that claim, but made clear that it did not affect the immediate charging decision. Any medical or mental health considerations were noted for later court proceedings. Investigators maintained that their responsibility was to document the facts surrounding Mendez's death, not to speculate on potential defenses. During questioning, Arroyo Roman also claimed that he had killed 3 other people in Puerto Rico. Law enforcement officials publicly stated that this assertion was unverified. As of reporting in 2025, no evidence had been presented to support the claim, and no additional charges related to Puerto Rico had been filed. Authorities cautioned that such statements can arise during custodial interviews for many reasons, including confusion or psychological distress. They stressed that the New Haven case stood on its own evidentiary foundation. Throughout the process, police and prosecutors avoided expanding the narrative beyond what could be confirmed. The case was presented through documented facts: a homicide in New Haven, a suspect charged, and a financial dispute identified as the immediate context. Claims that could not be verified were recorded but not incorporated into the central account. The record reflects a clear progression: a belief that money was owed, continued insistence on repayment, ongoing contact without resolution, a final meeting, and a fatal outcome. Investigators emphasized that the case was not about the size of the debt, but about how pressure and proximity can reshape ordinary disputes. In the end, the legal system reduced the events to what could be proven. Naisha Mendez was killed, and the responsibility for her death was assigned through evidence rather than interpretation. This case closes on facts, not resolution. The next story enters the same space where financial expectations narrow choices and private disagreements lose balance. In the third case, money was the motive, but exposure was the trigger. For Santi and Kenneth Kimes, debt and fraud were not temporary problems to solve. They were threats that had to be eliminated. Every decision they made flowed from one central calculation: if a person could expose the scheme, that person became dangerous. Once that line was crossed, delay was no longer useful. Silence had to be permanent. By the mid-1990s, Santa Kimes was living entirely on deception. She did not earn income in any conventional sense. Her lifestyle depended on forged documents, stolen identities, and exploiting people who trusted her. Loans replaced wages. Fraud replaced stability. Each scheme bought time, but only briefly. Legal pressure was growing, and money was disappearing faster than she could replace it. The margin for error was gone. One of the people pulled into that system was David Kasdan, a successful music executive in Los Angeles who had known Sante for years. Without his knowledge, Sante forged Kasdan's signature to secure a $280,000 loan, using his home as collateral. The loan provided short-term relief, but it also created a fixed deadline. If Kasdan discovered the fraud, the consequences would be immediate and irreversible. In 1998, Kasdan uncovered the forged loan tied to his property. His response was direct. He demanded explanations. He demanded repayment. He made clear that legal action was coming if the matter was not resolved. From Kasdan's perspective, this was a financial crime that needed correction. From the Kimisis' perspective, it was a countdown to prison. Communication did not collapse by mistake. Calls were avoided. Meetings were postponed. This was a deliberate delay, used to buy time while options narrowed. The money was gone. The forgery could not be undone. Exposure was inevitable. At that point, negotiation no longer served a purpose. In July 1998, Kenneth Kimes met Kasdan in Los Angeles. Outwardly, the meeting appeared to be about resolving the loan. Years later, Kenneth admitted that it was not. The decision had already been made. Kasdan was viewed as a direct threat to their freedom. During that meeting, Kenneth shot and killed him. Kasdan's body was later found in a dumpster. In 2005, Kenneth formally pleaded guilty in California, stating clearly that the murder was committed because Kasdan had discovered the forged loan and would not remain silent. For a time, the crime went unsolved. That silence reinforced a belief that the method worked. The Kimisis moved on, continuing fraud schemes across states. The pattern did not change. Identify a source of money, exploit access, delay accountability, remove the threat. That same structure soon appeared again, this time in New York. By late 1998, Sante had shifted her focus to Manhattan real estate. She learned about Irene Silverman, an elderly widow who owned a valuable Upper East Side townhouse. There was no personal history between them. Silverman was selected because of what she owned, her age and her isolation. Kenneth gained access by posing as a wealthy prospective tenant. Once inside Silverman's life, Sante began preparing forged documents designed to transfer control of the property. Deeds were altered. Paperwork was created to simulate consent. The plan depended on keeping Silverman compliant long enough for ownership to change hands. But time again became the problem. Silverman grew uneasy. Friends later testified that she appeared anxious and confused by changes involving her home. She questioned documents. She demanded explanations. She insisted on control of her property. Just as with Kasdan, delay replaced reassurance. Communication became inconsistent. Silence was used as a tool. This time, the confrontation was closer. Silverman was not calling from a distance. She was confronting them inside her own home. According to prosecutors, that resistance made her a risk that could not be managed through postponement alone. In July 1998, Irene Silverman was last seen entering her townhouse with Sante and Kenneth Kimes. There were no witnesses inside, no cameras, no immediate accountability. Evidence presented at trial showed that Silverman was restrained in her home and killed. Her body was never recovered, but the case was built on extensive circumstantial evidence. Forged deeds, audio recordings intended to mimic her consent, and detailed plans to seize her property. Silverman stopped answering her phone. Her daily routine vanished. Friends reported her missing. Investigators traced the fraudulent paperwork and uncovered the recordings. The same decision-making structure that led to Kasdan's murder had repeated with the same objective: remove the person who could expose the fraud. In 2000, Sante and Kenneth Kimes were convicted in New York of murder, kidnapping, robbery, and conspiracy in connection with Irene Silverman's death. Each received sentences totaling more than 100 years, ensuring they would never be released. The final link between the two cases came years later, with Kenneth's California plea. By admitting that Kasdan was killed specifically because he had discovered the forged loan, the motive became unmistakable. Both murders were driven by the same calculation. When financial fraud reaches the point where exposure cannot be delayed, violence becomes the final tool. Sante Kimes never left prison. She died in a New York correctional facility in 2014 while serving her sentence. Kenneth Kimes remains incarcerated, serving multiple life terms. I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Let's get straight to Case 4. The death sentence was received years after the violence that set the case in motion, but the chain of events began far from a courtroom. By early March 1997, addiction and desperation had already taken hold. Court records later showed that James Allen Coddington was in the middle of a multi-day cocaine binge, moving from one impulsive decision to the next. His judgment had deteriorated steadily. Money was no longer something he managed or planned for. It was something he chased. The person he turned to was not a stranger. Albert Troy Hale, 73, was a friend and co-worker who had known Coddington for years. Hale was described as dependable and generous, someone willing to help when others were struggling. On March 6, 1997, Coddington went to Hale's home in the Oklahoma City area to ask for money. Prosecutors later made clear that the visit was driven by urgency rather than friendship. The request was shaped by panic and addiction. When Hale refused, the encounter escalated. Inside the home, Coddington attacked Hale with a hammer. The injuries were severe, but not immediately fatal. After the assault, Coddington searched Hale's clothing and took exactly $525 from Hale's pocket, according to court records. He then fled the house. Hale was later discovered by his son, still alive but critically injured. He was rushed to a hospital where he died the following day. What followed showed that the attack was not an isolated act. Evidence presented at trial established that Coddington had robbed a convenience store before going to Hale's home, indicating that his need for money had already crossed into criminal behavior. After fleeing the scene, the pattern intensified. In the hours that followed, he robbed 5 additional convenience stores, moving quickly from one crime to the next. The $525 taken from Hale was not relief or resolution. It became part of a wider spree driven by addiction, flight, and loss of control. Coddington was later arrested and charged with first-degree murder. In 2003, a jury convicted him and sentenced him to death. At that point, the case appeared legally settled. The facts were established, and punishment was decided. But the legal process continued. In 2006, an appellate court upheld the conviction but overturned the death sentence, ruling that the sentencing phase had been flawed under evolving legal standards. The case returned to court. In 2008, a new jury was seated to reconsider punishment. After hearing the evidence again, that jury imposed the death penalty a second time. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors emphasized Coddington's state of mind at the time of the killing. Evidence showed that his cocaine binge had lasted several days and that his behavior had grown increasingly reckless. The robbery before the attack, followed by 5 more afterward, illustrated a clear pattern of escalation. The prosecution argued that this context did not excuse the crime. Instead, it explained how a request for money between longtime acquaintances could turn lethal within minutes. By 2022, Coddington had spent decades on death row. As his execution date approached, the case moved through its final mandatory reviews. One last option remained within the legal system: clemency. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board reviewed his request and, in a rare decision, voted 3-2 to recommend clemency. The recommendation reflected concerns raised during the process, including Coddington's long history of substance abuse and the complicated procedural history of his sentencing. The board's decision, however, was advisory. The final decision rested with the governor. On the eve of the scheduled execution, Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt denied clemency, allowing the sentence to proceed. With that decision, the final legal avenue closed. On August 25, 2022, James Allen Coddington was executed by lethal injection. The execution ended the legal process, but it did not alter the facts that began it. A request for money, a refusal, an attack inside a private home, and a man found by his son, alive but critically injured, who died the next day in a hospital. The violence ends here, but the pattern does not. What began as a private request collapsed into force when limits were reached. In the next case, the circumstances shift, yet the same pressure returns: money treated as a deadline rather than a resource. When patience runs out and options feel closed, decisions narrow, and the moment that follows carries weight far beyond what anyone expects. The fifth case unfolded on the morning of October 13, 2014. A routine visit to a quiet home in Duncan, Oklahoma, ended in silence that could not be explained. A housekeeper entering the Ruby family residence found 3 members of the household dead: John Ruby, his wife Joy Tinker Ruby, and their 17-year-old daughter, Catherine. All had been shot. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle visible from the outside, and no immediate explanation for how violence had entered a home that had appeared ordinary just days earlier. Investigators quickly determined that the deaths had not occurred that day. The condition of the bodies showed that the killings had taken place several days earlier on October 9, 2014. The gap between the deaths and their discovery became the first critical detail. Whoever was responsible had lived with the silence, and possibly within the house itself, during that time. Alan Ruby, 19 years old, lived in the home with his family. He was legally an adult but remained financially dependent on his parents. They provided housing, education support, and daily expenses. From the outside, the arrangement appeared stable. Inside the family, financial tension had been building. Alan's spending had increased, debts had accumulated, and his parents had begun to impose limits. Those limits eventually became a complete cutoff. Prosecutors later confirmed that Ruby owed money he could not repay and had repeatedly asked his parents for additional funds. When they refused, the decision was not understood by him as guidance or discipline. It was interpreted as rejection. The loss of financial support became, in his mind, a loss of standing and control within the household. Investigators and prosecutors later emphasized how entitlement developed in this space. Ruby did not see financial help as conditional. He saw it as something owed to him. As debts mounted and access narrowed, humiliation followed. Each refusal reinforced the belief that he was being restricted and denied what he believed should remain available. Money became the measure of value. Without it, he perceived himself as diminished. Evidence showed that Ruby began viewing his family's estate as a solution to his financial problems. In this mindset, inheritance was no longer a distant future matter tied to time and loss. It became an answer delayed by living people. The presence of his parents and sister shifted from family relationships to obstacles standing between him and financial relief. The killings themselves were not impulsive. After shooting his father, mother, and sister inside the home, Ruby took deliberate steps to control the aftermath. Investigators later documented efforts to remove surveillance recordings and dispose of the firearm. These actions demonstrated planning and awareness rather than panic or emotional collapse. As law enforcement reconstructed the timeline, contradictions surfaced quickly. Ruby's statements failed to align with physical evidence and verified movements. The investigation did not unfold as a question of who committed the murders, but of when the decision had been finalized. By the time attention centered on Ruby, the psychological shift had already occurred days earlier. The violence marked the end of a process driven by financial resentment and perceived betrayal. Court proceedings clarified the motive without ambiguity. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that Ruby's parents had cut him off financially because of irresponsible spending and mounting debt. They also demonstrated that he believed killing his family would grant him access to their estate and resolve his financial problems. The financial motive was direct, documented, and uncontested. In March 2016, Ruby pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, removing the need for a full trial. Sentencing reflected accountability without prolonging the process. Although the crimes were eligible for the death penalty, surviving family members asked prosecutors to avoid a lengthy trial. Their request was honored. Ruby received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring permanent incarceration while limiting further legal proceedings. What remains after this case is not just loss, but recognition. When money becomes identity and refusal is experienced as erasure, Decisions begin to shift long before any action occurs. The Hruby case marks one point along a broader line, where financial conflict quietly changes roles, alters judgment, and sets the stage for the next story to follow. Let's now get into Case 6, where Natalie Cochran was first sentenced in federal court for a financial crime. The case, at that stage, centered on money, paperwork, and promises that never matched reality. Prosecutors showed that she had created an investment operation that appeared polished and reliable on the surface. It offered steady returns, clear explanations, and the image of successful business growth. Investors were told their funds were being placed into legitimate ventures tied to government contracts and technology services. Bank records, contracts, and presentations all reinforced that belief. In truth, the operation produced no real profit. New money coming in was used to pay earlier investors, creating the illusion that the businesses were working exactly as promised. As long as fresh funds continued to arrive, the structure held together. When that flow slowed, the system began to fail. The collapse exposed the scale of the losses. Savings disappeared. Retirement funds were gone. Trust between friends, families, and business partners was broken. The damage was extensive, but it fit a familiar pattern seen in many financial fraud cases. The federal conviction reflected that understanding. The evidence was paper-based. The harm was financial. The sentence imposed was long and serious, tied directly to fraud and deception. At the time, the case appeared complete. There was no public allegation of physical harm. There was no arrest related to a death. The story, as it was understood then, was about money, betrayal, and abuse of trust. Only later did the investigation widen. After the fraud case concluded, federal agents and state investigators continued reviewing records connected to the businesses and the household. With the benefit of hindsight, certain events no longer appeared isolated. Attention returned to the death of her husband, Michael Cochran, in February 2019. When he collapsed inside their home, the incident had raised questions but did not immediately result in criminal charges. He was taken to the hospital, treated, and later transferred to hospice care. Several days after the initial collapse, he died. At the time, the moment passed quietly. No arrest followed, no charges were filed. With the fraud now fully documented, investigators had new context. They began to reconsider the pressure inside the home during the months leading up to Michael Cochran's death. The financial case showed that deadlines were closing in. Investor expectations were growing harder to manage. The businesses were not generating income. Michael Cochran held a 49% ownership stake in the companies. He had access to accounts. He could see discrepancies. He could ask questions that could not be answered honestly. Witness testimony later showed that he had begun expressing concern about the finances. Text messages and statements indicated that he was trying to understand why money was moving the way it was. Inside a system dependent on silence and delay, his curiosity carried weight. His role shifted from partner to risk. The fraud case explained why tension inside the household had intensified. It also explained why his continued presence mattered. Physical evidence completed what financial records suggested. During a later search of the home, investigators found insulin. Michael Cochran was not diabetic. Medical experts explained that insulin, when introduced improperly into the body of a non-diabetic person, can cause blood sugar levels to fall to dangerous levels very quickly. Symptoms can include confusion, loss of consciousness, and death. Toxicology testing confirmed that insulin poisoning caused Michael Cochran's death. This finding changed the nature of the case entirely. What had once appeared to be a medical emergency now carried forensic clarity. The evidence pointed to intentional administration rather than an accident. The investigation moved from financial misconduct to homicide. A second prosecution followed, separate from the federal case. Natalie Cochran was charged in state court with first-degree murder. The focus was no longer on spreadsheets or investor presentations. It was on motive, access, and timing. Prosecutors argued that removing Michael Cochran eliminated the one person inside the household whose position, questions and authority could expose the fraud before it fully collapsed. His death, they argued, bought time and removed internal resistance. During trial, the state laid out the sequence carefully. Jurors heard about the mounting financial pressure. They heard about ownership stakes and access to information. They heard expert testimony explaining how insulin affects the body and why its presence could not be explained by medical treatment. The argument was direct and methodical. The killing was presented not as an emotional act, but as a decision tied to control and self-preservation. In January 2025, a jury in Raleigh County convicted Natalie Cochran of first-degree murder. Under state law, the sentence was life in prison. The outcome placed two convictions side by side, one for financial fraud and one for killing the person whose role threatened to expose it. What follows this case is not closure, but continuity. The same forces remain at work: financial strain, fear of exposure, and the need to maintain control. The Cochran case stands as one link in a longer chain where money shifts relationships and sets the conditions for the next story to unfold. Moving on to the seventh case, Riverdale was quiet in the early morning hours of December 9, 2023, when police were called to an alley on the 14,400 block of South Wallace Avenue. It was still dark, and most people in the neighborhood were asleep. Just after 3:30 a.m., officers arrived at the location and saw flames coming from a narrow space behind the buildings. As they moved closer, they found a woman's body on fire. The scene showed clear signs of severe violence. Firefighters worked to put out the flames while police secured the area. Investigators later said the woman had been beaten and stabbed before her body was set on fire. The damage from both the injuries and the fire made it clear that this was not an accident. At the time officers first reached the alley, they did not know who the woman was. Her body was badly burned, and there were no documents or personal items that could immediately identify her. Police began the slow process of trying to learn her name. They looked for anything that had survived the fire. Investigators noticed a distinctive watch and a visible tattoo. These details became the center of a public request for help. Images were released, and police asked anyone who recognized them to come forward. Only after that public appeal did the woman's family realize what had happened. The victim was identified as Danielle Banks, a 29-year-old woman from Harvey, Illinois. For Danielle's family, the identification brought shock and pain. Until that point, they had not known where she was or why she had not come home. The confirmation ended uncertainty, but replaced it with loss. Police informed them that Danielle had been found dead under violent circumstances. The news spread quickly, and attention turned to how and why such a crime could happen. Within days, prosecutors announced charges against 3 people. Authorities said the investigation had moved quickly once they identified Danielle. According to police and court filings, the charges were tied to a dispute over a small amount of money. Prosecutors stated that the individuals now charged believed Danielle owed them approximately $65. The amount itself was small, but the claim carried weight because it was used as pressure. There was no written agreement, no official loan record, and no clear public evidence presented that the debt existed. What mattered, according to investigators, was that the belief alone shaped what followed. In situations like this, money stops being just money. It becomes a way to control or accuse. There was no formal system to settle the issue and no mediator to step in. Communication narrowed, messages slowed or stopped. When disputes reach this point, they do not disappear. They sit unresolved. One side believes it is owed something. The other lives with that belief hanging over them, without a clear way to fix it. The longer it lasts, the heavier it becomes. Prosecutors allege that as the tension grew, Danielle Banks came into contact with 3 people now charged in the case: Scotty Job Scott, Keith Bassett, and Latoya Larimore Milans. According to investigators, what followed was not a conversation about repayment and not a decision to walk away. Authorities allege the encounter turned into planned violence involving more than one person. Court records outline evidence that prosecutors say supports this claim. Investigators allege that during the attack, LaToya Larimore Malons played a song titled "Killing the Rats." Prosecutors say the music was used to block out Danielle Banks's screams. Authorities also state that phone records show Larimore Malons searched online for phrases related to killing and burning a body before the incident. These details have been presented as signs of intent and preparation. The defendants have not been convicted, and these claims remain allegations that will be tested in court. In the hours before her death, there was no public sign that Danielle was in immediate danger. Her life appeared routine to those around her. She did not post warnings, and there were no reports of a visible confrontation. Her absence only became clear when she failed to return home. Messages went unanswered. Concern grew among people who knew her. That silence did not mean the conflict had ended. It meant it was no longer visible to others. All three defendants were charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that the seriousness of the alleged actions, along with the claim that multiple people were involved, made the case especially severe. They asked the court to hold the defendants without pretrial release. A judge agreed with that request. All three were ordered detained as the case moved forward through the Cook County court system. As the case entered public view, more personal details emerged. Danielle Banks's father, Ray Banks, spoke openly and acknowledged that his daughter had struggled with addiction. He described her as someone who faced challenges but was still deeply loved. Other family members strongly rejected the idea that a claim over $65 could explain her death. They expressed anger and disbelief on social media, saying the explanation did not match who Danielle was or the value of her life. The case continues to move through the legal system. The charges remain allegations, and the court process will determine responsibility. What remains clear is that a minor financial claim, whether real or imagined, became the center of a fatal outcome. This case does not stand alone. It sits beside others, where small claims became points of pressure, and pressure turned into force. As this story moves out of view, the pattern remains. Another life, another dispute, another moment where a belief about money carried consequences far beyond its value. In Case 8, the evidence shows planning, waiting, and control, the judge told the court. This was not a momentary loss of temper. It was a sequence of deliberate decisions. From the opening lines of sentencing, the court made clear how it understood the case against Derek Martin, not as a sudden collapse, but as an intentional course of conduct shaped over time. The judge explained that Martin's actions could only be understood by looking at what came before the killings. For years, Martin had carried a grievance tied to money and status. He believed he had been dismissed and ignored, and that belief became central to his sense of self. The court accepted the prosecution's position that this grievance was not confined to a single debt or recent disagreement. It was a long-running fixation that grew stronger as Martin's former role in the family faded. Martin had once been Chloe Bashford's stepfather. The judge noted that this former position carried authority in Martin's mind, even after it no longer existed in reality. When Chloe married Josh Bashford and built a life without him, Martin experienced that separation not simply as distance, but as rejection. Money became the focus through which that rejection was interpreted. Repayment was treated as validation. The absence of repayment became humiliation. Over time, the court found that humiliation hardened into entitlement. Turning to the events of 2023, the judge described the killings inside the Bashfords' home as purposeful and controlled. Martin arrived with weapons. He attacked Chloe Bashford first using a hammer and a knife. The court avoided graphic detail but stressed the importance of the method. This was close, personal violence. It required intent and effort. It was not something done accidentally or reflexively. The judge emphasized what followed as one of the most damning aspects of the case. After killing Chloe, Martin did not leave. He stayed inside the house and waited. This pause mattered. It showed awareness, time for reflection, and the ability to stop. When Josh Bashford returned home, Martin attacked him, stabbing and strangling him. The judge stated plainly that waiting for the second victim destroyed any suggestion of an uncontrollable emotional episode. Addressing the defense case, the judge reviewed the psychiatric evidence in detail. 5 psychiatrists had given evidence. Some supported a partial defense of diminished responsibility linked to depression. Others did not. The jury had rejected that defense. The judge agreed with their conclusion. Depression and emotional distress were acknowledged, but the court drew a firm line between understanding mental health difficulties and excusing deliberate violence. The sequence of actions, bringing weapons, killing one victim, waiting, and killing another, demonstrated choice and control. The judge then turned to Martin's behavior after the killings. Rather than fleeing or seeking help, Martin collected Chloe and Josh's 4 children from school. He took them to McDonald's and Costa Coffee. He maintained a calm, everyday routine. He also used Chloe's phone to reply to a child's message about a sleepover, writing, "Mom said not today." The judge described this as an act of concealment, designed to delay discovery of the crimes and preserve a false appearance of normal life. These post-offense actions carried heavy weight in sentencing. They showed planning, deception, and emotional detachment. The judge stated that such conduct was incompatible with a claim of mental collapse. Only after completing these steps did Martin turn himself in to the police. His surrender, the judge said, did not erase the seriousness of what had already been done. In passing sentence in 2024, the judge outlined the aggravating factors in clear terms. There were 2 victims. The killings were deliberate. Weapons were brought to the scene. Martin waited for the second victim. The crimes took place inside the victim's own home. There was a serious breach of family trust. There was an attempt to conceal the offenses and shield the truth from the victim's children. This judgment closes one story, but it does not close the pattern. What happened here reflects how unresolved grievances can shift from private thought to decisive action. As this case ends, the focus moves forward to another situation where obligation, control, and resentment followed a different path but reached an irreversible result. As Case 9 unfolds, more than £100,000 in unpaid debt sat over Armen Aristakesyan long before he became a convicted murderer. By 2019, prosecutors showed that the pressure had become severe. The money was owed to multiple unlicensed lenders, including loan sharks operating outside lawful financial systems. Repayment demands were constant. Messages and calls showed no pause, no reduction, only escalation. Aristakesyan had no stable income capable of clearing those debts. The pressure was not abstract. It was immediate, persistent, and closing in. For around 3 years, Aristakesyan had known Serafima Mashaka, a 58-year-old woman living alone in Ealing, West London. Over time, he befriended her and gained her trust. Evidence presented at trial showed that he knew she kept large sums of cash inside her flat, reportedly set aside for building and renovation work. This was not casual knowledge. It came from familiarity built over years. In October 2021, inside the Old Bailey, Aristakesyan stood as a judge delivered a life sentence. The minimum term was fixed at 33 years before parole could even be considered. The court named the victim, Serafima Mashaka. She was killed inside her own home. At that moment, the outcome was clear, but the sequence that led there still needed to be understood. On the 18th of September 2019, police were called to Mashaka's flat in Ealing. Inside, officers discovered her body. She had suffered fatal head injuries caused by repeated blows from a blunt object. Investigators immediately focused on a defining detail. There were no signs of forced entry. The door was intact. The lock was undamaged. Whoever entered had been let inside. Attention returned to Aristakesyan. CCTV footage captured him arriving at Mashaka's apartment building on the day she died. He entered without difficulty. There was no visible confrontation, no disturbance in the hallway. Later that same day, cameras recorded him leaving the building carrying a large bag. At the time, the images appeared unremarkable. No one nearby understood what had already taken place inside the flat. By the date of that visit, Aristokesyan's debts were accelerating rather than easing. Prosecutors demonstrated that repayment demands intensified in the weeks leading up to Mashaka's death. Loan sharks wanted money immediately. The court heard that Aristokesyan knew exactly where cash was kept inside the flat and had a clear sense of how much might be available. That knowledge became central to the prosecution case. Investigators concluded that Mashaka was attacked inside her home after allowing Aristokesyan entry. She was struck repeatedly with a blunt object, injuries that proved fatal. After her death, cash and personal belongings were taken from the property. Prosecutors argued that the theft was not incidental. It was directly connected to Aristokesyan's attempt to relieve his financial pressure. When questioned by police, Aristokesyan did not deny visiting Mashaka that day. He admitted going to her flat to ask for money. According to his account, she was alive when he left. He said there had been no violence during the visit. That statement became the foundation of his defense. He also addressed the bag seen on CCTV. Aristokesyan claimed it did not contain stolen cash. Instead, he said it held charity shop items that Mashaka had given him. This explanation was placed before the jury and examined alongside the wider evidence. Jurors were asked to measure that account against the facts. They reviewed CCTV footage tracking Aristokesyan's movements. They listened to phone calls he made after leaving the flat. They considered the timing of those calls alongside forensic findings from the scene. Prosecutors argued that the sequence left no room for his version of events. The jury rejected his account. They concluded that Mashaka was killed during the visit and that Aristokesyan left the flat carrying stolen property. His claim that she was alive when he departed was dismissed. At trial, financial motive remained central. Jurors heard detailed evidence about the scale of the debt and the nature of the lenders involved. They were shown how pressure increased over time. The prosecution argued that the killing was driven by desperation linked directly to money, shaped by trust, access, and opportunity. Aristokesyan was found guilty of murder. The jury concluded that the killing was deliberate and financially motivated. His explanations were rejected in full. The judge described the attack as brutal and calculated. Now to the final case. The financial arrangement began as a straightforward car restoration agreement, with roughly $10,000 provided so a vehicle could be repaired and returned to standard. The work was carried out by Michael Hayes for Alexander Ivan Rasic, and as time passed, expectations and results moved further apart. The vehicle was not completed to the standard that Rasic believed had been promised. Deadlines slipped. What should have remained a practical dispute over workmanship and repayment became personal, shaped by frustration, pride, and the feeling of being wronged. That unresolved dispute followed both men into public space. On the night of May 27, 2023, they encountered each other on the Gold Coast. Witnesses later described a short exchange rather than a prolonged argument. There was no extended struggle and no attempt to disengage before tempers peaked. In a moment that lasted seconds, Rasic struck Hayes once. There were no further blows. The damage came from what followed. Hayes fell backward and struck his head on the pavement. Medical evidence presented to the court established catastrophic injuries, including a fractured skull and bleeding on the brain. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked to save his life. His condition remained critical for several days. On June 1, 2023, 5 days after the assault, Hayes died from those injuries. The gap between the punch and the death became central to how the case was assessed. So-called one-punch cases are defined by this separation between action and outcome. The violence itself is brief, but the harm unfolds later, often outside public view. Prosecutors emphasized that while Rasic did not set out to kill Hayes, the risk attached to striking someone with force was obvious and foreseeable. Under the law, harm is measured by consequence, not by the duration of the act. After Hayes's death, police charged Rasic with unlawful striking causing death under Queensland law. The offense is designed to address fatal assaults that are not premeditated but still result in loss of life. Rasik was initially granted bail under strict conditions. As the case progressed, he entered a guilty plea, accepting responsibility for the blow that caused Hayes' death. That plea was later considered during sentencing. At the December 2025 sentencing hearing, the court examined both the assault and the surrounding context. The judge accepted that the act was impulsive rather than planned. The court also made clear that impulsivity does not remove responsibility. The sentence needed to reflect the seriousness of the outcome, the loss suffered by the victim's family, and the need to deter similar conduct. The court heard evidence about Rasic's personal history, including significant mental health challenges. Medical reports outlined diagnoses of bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, linked in part to a traumatic event in 2014 when Rasic witnessed his father's death. The judge treated this material as background that explained life circumstances, not as justification for violence. Mental health informed the balance of the sentence, not the finding of guilt. Rasic's conduct after the assault was also weighed. Evidence showed that he left the scene. He was later arrested carrying a packed bag containing clothing, a passport, and approximately $4,000 in cash. Prosecutors argued this suggested awareness of the seriousness of what had occurred. The court did not treat the behavior as proof of intent to kill, but it influenced how responsibility and remorse were evaluated. The court further considered messages sent while Hayes remained in the hospital. Prosecutors referenced communications sent to Rasic's partner during that period, arguing their tone reflected a lack of concern for the victim's condition. These messages were not the basis of conviction, but they formed part of the broader picture considered at sentencing. In imposing the sentence, the judge emphasized choice. The court noted that alternatives existed at the moment of confrontation, including disengagement and lawful resolution of the financial dispute. A single decision closed off those paths. The 9-year prison term, with a requirement to serve 80% before parole eligibility, reflected the fatal result and the court's assessment of the surrounding conduct. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.